Hi everyone, and welcome back to Octopus Builds, where we are building out the Trident project for the fictional company Octo Pet Shop. In today's episode, we're going to be talking all about security. So what happened was the security team has reached out to us, and they want to make sure that we have appropriate protections in place. And so they sent over this permissions matrix to us. And what they basically want to make sure is that the people who are making the change to the deployment process, who have control over the deployment process, cannot deploy to production. That is one of the company policies that's in place, and I'd say that's fairly common for a lot of other industries, where the person who makes the change can't be the person who finally deploys it out to production. And so let's take a little look at this matrix just to make sure that we kind of level set where everything is. So as a developer, they have the ability to modify the deployment process because they know how to deploy their application. In addition, they have permissions to modify variables within the project or library variable sets because, again, they know what variables are needed to successfully deploy their application. They can also deploy to development as well as to QA, but they can't deploy to staging or production. The reason for not deploying to, say, staging is that QA needs to finish up their process, and they want to make sure they get sign-off for everything. And so before that, so QA is really the kind of the gatekeeper deploying to staging. Now, for QA, they're not really familiar with how the deployment, how the application needs to get deployed, nor are they familiar with all the variables and all the nuances with something like that. So they don't have permission to make any sort of changes with that. In addition, there's no reason for them to have to deploy to development. They're not making any changes to the deployment process or anything like that. They really only need to come into account when they want to deploy to their own environment, which is QA, or when they're done testing and they're ready to go to staging. Now, for web admins, they don't have any permissions to modify the deployment process or any variables. However, they can deploy to any environment that they want. And again, this is fairly common because a web admin, they probably don't know all the nuances of how to deploy a particular application. You know, what order, is there any variables they need to know about, anything along those lines. And finally, DBAs. And I included DBAs in here as well, as they have the ability to modify the deployment process in variables. And that's because a DBA would have permissions or have knowledge of things like sensitive variables, such as, let's take a look at our variables that we already have, such as the server name, the database username, and most importantly, the database password. So they're aware of those particular values, and so they can come in here and they can make the change. In addition, they might want to make a change to make database deployments a little bit more effective or anything like that. In practice, based on previous experience, I didn't see a whole lot of DBAs making any sort of changes to the deployment process. Mostly they just needed permissions to edit the variables. Alrighty, so let's go ahead and let's get that set up within the instance. So what we're going to want to do is let's take a look at the user roles to find the appropriate user role for development, for developers specifically. So let's go back to our permissions matrix, and what we want to do is we want to make sure that a developer, they can modify the deployment process and variables, and they have the ability to deploy to dev and QA. So Octopus Deploy out of the box provides a number of roles that we can reference, and these roles are what dictates permissions. So the two roles that we're going to be most interested in is project contributor and deployment creator. So let's go ahead and let's take a look at what does a role mean. And so a role within Octopus Deploy, that is what is limiting or granting permissions to various actions throughout the system. Now I clicked on view selected only to limit it, but the big reason behind that is because there are a ton of roles out here. There are tons of permissions within Octopus Deploy, and it can very easily get cross-eyed with everything. So a project contributor, they can come in and they can view accounts, they can create any sort of step templates. They also have the ability to edit the project, edit the deployment process, create any sort of triggers, update variables. So this is exactly what we want someone who has project contributor rights, such as a developer, to have the permissions to. However, they do not have permissions to deploy. So they can't create a deployment, or they can delete a deployment. All they can do is view a deployment. And at the same time, they don't have permissions to create a release or delete a release or an edit release. And again, that's fairly common for contributors. Again, we want to get that separation of concerns. And once we have everything set up, in fact, the developers, they would very rarely create releases, if at all. It's actually going to be the build server that's going to be responsible for something like that, because the build server will build the package and the artifact, push it up to Octopus Deploy to deploy that code that needs to be pushed out to those build artifacts or those packages, and then it will go out to to the development automatically, because that would be like the very first thing that you would do. So it would, as time goes on, I would actually expect a regular developer probably won't have these permissions, because it will be accomplished by, say, a build server and a trigger. And we'll get into that into later episodes. But for now, we want to give permission, the ability for the developer to do this. So let's take a look at the other role, which is the deployment creator. And so this particular role has the ability to create a deployment and view a deployment, along with a bunch of other view permissions, which is great. So that we want that. And then finally, we want to have the release creator role. So release creator, they have the ability to create a release and view a release. So that's the permission that we want to grant to developers. So how do we do that? Now, roles are attached to users via teams. So a team is pretty much what it says. It's a group of individuals or a group of user accounts that have specific permissions granted to them. So there are some teams that are automatically created, and we actually created a team earlier in a previous episode called Trident Notifications. So let's go ahead and let's add a team, and let's just call this team developers. And we want to make this just a space-only team. And what that means is this team only exists in this particular space. If I want to make this team available to all spaces, then I would make something like a system team. But for simplicity's sake, let's just focus on one space at a time. Now let's go in and let's add in some user roles. And let's talk through what happens here. So the first thing we want to do is let's add the project contributor role. Now what I like about this is it will show you all the permissions, and you can get cross-site pretty quickly. Contributor has quite a bit of permissions. And let's go ahead and hit apply. So now the developers, they can contribute to projects, so they can edit. So we've satisfied these two requirements. And then let's go in and let's add in deployment creator. But for this particular one, we want to define the scope, and we want to limit this to only development and QA. We don't want to grant any additional permissions outside of that. So now what we've done is we have satisfied these two requirements, as well as these two requirements, because as you can see, they don't have permissions to deploy to staging or production. I need to add in one additional role for right now, and in future release, future episode, we'll probably be taking this away, but that is the ability to create a release. And that's only so we can create a release and deploy it to development. So this is what a developer has permissions to do. Now let's go ahead and let's add in QA, because QA is a little bit more, has a little bit more restrictions associated with it. So the nice thing about this is we only need to add in the project deployer role, excuse me, the deployment creator role. And we're going to define scope, and we're going to say this is limited to QA and to staging. So they can view anything in the project, but they can't make any sort of changes. So we have satisfied all of these requirements by just setting up this particular team like this. Awesome. And then finally, not finally, we want to add in the web admins, because we want to make sure that they have permissions to deploy to staging and basically all the environments. So we go on to let's go ahead and let's do a deployment creator, and we're not going to define any sort of scope whatsoever. They have permissions to do to deploy to any environment, and we'll also give them the ability to create a release just in case they need to deploy to dev. So we have satisfied all of these requirements so far, and then finally let's add in the DBAs. All right, so they have permissions to only contribute to a project. Project contributor. Apply. Because again, we don't want to give them any permissions to deploy anywhere. All they can do is modify the deployment process and modify the variables. So let's go ahead and click on Save. Awesome. So we have created a separate team for DBAs, another one for developers, another one for QA, and then another one for our web admins. Now you've noticed inside of here that we only have so many members associated with this. And right now we don't have anybody in the DBA team or the developer team or the QA team or the web admin team. And that's because the number of users is limited to just myself and the web admin, the Octopus Cloud Octo admin service account that's automatically created. So I'm the only user right now, and I have basically the equivalent of the Octopus admin permissions. And so I can do whatever I want to do. And you can actually see what permissions a person can do by coming over to test permissions. So I can see, yep, and I can say, what can I see in my Octopus build space? And I have permissions to do pretty much everything. So we don't need to create any sort of Octopus admin or Octopus manager roles because those are automatically created as part, those teams are automatically created as part of just general creation. Awesome. So let's go ahead and let's add in a couple of users. Now, I'm using my Octopus Cloud instance, and by default, the users and roles and everything along those lines, that's limited to Octopus ID, so you'd have to log into octopus.com. However, I really don't want to go in and do that. I kind of want to manage my teams and everything like that. And in a future episode, I probably will be setting up Azure AD or Google Apps. And what that will allow me to do is I can come in here into my team, and then I could add an external group and role, and I could say, hey, so if I'm using, say, Azure AD, I could say, hey, look for everyone that has a developer role in Azure AD and automatically add them to this particular team. So I won't have to worry about user membership. But for now, I want to kind of keep it simple and not have to worry about that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to enable username and password. All right, so that is enabled. Happy days. Now, what this means is I can now invite users to my Octopus deploy. Oops, I probably just need to refresh. Let's try refreshing. Go to accounts. I don't really want to do that. Make sure I got this set up right. So that's enabled. And let's just go ahead and let's just log out just to see what happens. So I do have the ability to add in, okay, so I can sign in with that. So I can sign in with my Octopus ID. Sometimes it just takes a second for things to kind of kick over. All right. Cool. User invites has been enabled. Sweet. So that was probably what I was missing. So I want to invite someone to the developer team, and I want to have one quantity. And let's go ahead and let's create. So I want to provide this link to this particular person. So what I'm going to do is behind the scenes, I'm actually going to go ahead and create a couple of users, and I will be back while I do this really quick. All right, I'm back using the power of editing. We now have a number of users. So I've created John the DBA, Bernie the developer, Roshni the QA person, and then Sean the web admin. And I have assigned them to the various teams. So you can see the DBA has John the DBA. You can see developers has Bernie the developer. QA has Roshni. And the web admins have Sean. Cool. So what we can do now is we can do a couple of things. We can first, let's go to test permissions, and let's just pick up on Bernie the developer, because that's probably the most important one, as he has quite a bit of permissions and we want to make sure that they can't deploy to production. So let's go ahead and do Octopus Build Space, and he is part of the, shouldn't be part of the space managers. That's, oh yeah, that's, he has access to his private space. Whoops, that confused me. So if private space is an EAP release feature right now. It's only available on Octopus Cloud. So if you might see it pop up in some interesting spots. We're working through some of those interesting little tidbits like that. So that makes a lot more sense now. All right, but we can see that he has limited permissions to development and QA. And if we wanted to, we could also export these user permissions, and that would put it out to a CSV file, or it won't. And what we can then do is, I'm going to go ahead and sign out, and I am going to sign in as Bernie. And let's go ahead and sign in. No, I do not want LastPass. Remember that? So now I'm signed in as Bernie, and I can see what it looks like to him. So as you can see, he has permissions to deploy to QA, but not to staging or production, because we have this one release ready to go, and this release is ready to go. So that is perfect. That's exactly what we want. If I go into my process, I can add steps. I can add a script step, and the save button is enabled. Perfect. And then with variables, I have the ability to come in here and I can change, call this tridents for temporarily, save it, change it back, save it. Awesome. Happy days. So this particular, we are good to go with everything in terms of permissions. If we wanted to, we could also just, as a final verification, let's just QA and see what their experience would look like. Probably wouldn't have a username, just QA. I just did that just for simplicity's sake. So this is interesting. They only have permissions to view QA and staging. And they can deploy to QA and staging, but they can't see anything else. So let's go ahead and let's fix that. So I'm going to go ahead and sign out. And I'm going to sign back in with my Octopus ID. So I'm going to sign in with my permissions. So permissions is one of those things that it's good to test out a number of these different things. That way you can kind of see. I do like creating a couple of test users just to make sure that I have everything set up correctly, especially if I'm brand new to an instance or I'm just setting everything up initially. But let's go ahead and let's change the QA team. And what I'm going to do is I am going to add the project viewer permission. So they can see everything. They can view releases, deployments, runbooks, and everything like that, but they can't do anything. This permission where the deployment creator is limited to only QA and staging, and they can only see QA and staging, that might be handy for a subset of users, but for someone that's like, say, on the QA team, that is not very handy. And at the same time, I'm also going to do the same thing for our DBA. I'm going to go ahead and grant them oh, they should have permissions to see everything. So they're good. They should be good to go with that. Awesome. So let's go ahead and let's sign back out and let's sign back in as the QA person. Kind of want to test the DBA right now after this, so that we can see that they can see development, QA, staging, and production. That's perfect. They can see the status of everything, and they can only deploy to QA into staging. They can't deploy to production. They also cannot create release. If I come in here, I cannot add a step. And for variables, I can't even see the variables. So there we go. So now we know the limitations of what the QA person has. For the DBA, let's go ahead and let's just take a look at what they can do. So they can't deploy anything, but they can edit the changes and they can view the variables and edit the variables. And then finally, just to, I'm pretty sure it's web admin. Yep, yay. They can view this, so they can go to deployment, QA, staging, and production, but they can't view any variables. They can deploy anything. They can view the process. They can view the process, but they can't see anything else. and they can actually even create a release. So they have the appropriate permissions that we want to grant them. They don't have permissions to change anything, which is perfect. So yes, this is in terms of meeting our goals for the permissions matrix. We have accomplished everything for today, and we've restricted permissions to the appropriate roles. So thank you very much for joining me for this episode. This one ran a little bit longer, but permissions is one of those things that it's good to see and get and test and make sure that you have it dialed in just appropriately for granting the appropriate amount of permissions. And I will see you in the next episode. Have a great day.